The story, the Home Secretary Suella Braverman warning that uncontrolled immigration is an existential threat as she attacked absurd international refugee rules in that speech in Washington, D.C. just yesterday. She was highlighting the Channel boat crisis. She warned that unless governments found a way of controlling borders, they would not endure. She also delivered a stinging rebuke to those who dismiss people alarmed about immigration as bigots and idiots, arguing that the failure of multiculturalism was evident from the streets of Paris, Brussels and Leicester. She insisted migrants could no longer be allowed to come to the UK and live parallel lives rather than integrating. She also added that fearing discrimination for being gay should not be enough to qualify for international refugee protection. Let's get some thoughts on this one from asylum lawyer David Haigh. David, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ian. How are you?
All right, nice to have you with us. Whenever we dip our toe into this subject, whether it happens on a TV or a radio show like this, or whether it happens in the pub, there's always an almighty row, isn't there? Because it tends to ultimately just revert back to your pro or your anti. But actually, this is a discussion that is rightly full of nuances.
Absolutely, and this is I'm not a fan of Suella Braverman. I've said many times before how many of the policies that she's brought forward were doomed to fail from the beginning, and they're nothing more than press stunts. But I wrote an article for the Daily Mail yesterday that basically said that a lot of what she has said should be applauded. Not all of it, but a lot of it should be applauded. She's taken the issue to a global stage, which is where there are potentials to fix the problems that we're all facing, because at the moment the system is broken, but not just in England, it's broken around the world. It's not benefiting the countries themselves, and it's not benefiting the genuine asylum seekers that need our help.
Indeed. And I hadn't realised until digging into this, because of this story, that the United States have had 2 million people arrive this year alone, which is why I think in part she chose the United States to flag this up. And of course her point was international, because ultimately at the root of all of this, I think I'm reflecting her point accurately here, is the UN Convention, which kind of suggests that huge amount of numbers would be given the green light to seek home elsewhere under the current rules.
Well, Ian, that's correct in a way. I mean, where the problems that we all see, whether it's with the ECHR or whether it's with the UN Refugee Convention or our own Human Rights Act, the legislation itself is fairly clear. The problems that we get is the interpretation of that. So when it's the judges interpret what is persecution. Now, obviously, when the UN Refugee Convention was written a long time ago, persecution, the interpretation has changed quite a lot. And we see this. I don't know if you remember, there was a story about the former Defence Secretary saying that there was a ridiculous situation where if the UK is in a foreign country carrying out a military operation, they can kill or shoot a terrorist, that's fine, but they can't capture one because of the definition of jurisdiction. So the problem is the interpretation, the implementation of it, and that's something which needs to be addressed. And so that's good that she raised it on the global stage. Will anything change? It takes years to change a convention, so it's not going to go anywhere. But it's at least a positive start.
Indeed. In terms of the sort of the nub of what she said here, David, she was at pains to say, even though certain quarters of the political spectrum will choose to disagree with this bit or ignore this bit, she did say it's not about race. She did say it's not about, we've rubbed along with lots of different cultures. She wasn't attacking any of that. She does, of course, have her own backstory, which one I think could reasonably say would inform her experience of this kind of thing. But her point was just in practical terms, I think, you can't have that amount of immigration this quickly without there being a problem at the other end.
Well, exactly, and like I said, I mean, as a human rights lawyer, I mean, I think we all want to see the people that are really at risk of harm to life, real risk, that are under real persecution around the world. Everyone that's in that situation deserves a right of asylum, and that's what we must protect. But what we're seeing is an awful lot of fake claims, people that are economic migrants, and I don't want to diminish things, but jumping on that bandwagon, and that's unsustainable in the current system, and that's what's causing the problem. So we're really causing issues for the genuine people as well as the countries that are accepting them, and that's very, very concerning.
Indeed, and I've long made this point. I've been to and I say this as a factual observation. There's no politics in this. It's just merely what I've seen and what I take from the current Channel migrant story as an example. I've been to Calais a number of times. I've spoken to people who are wanting to make that journey. And then when I speak to journalists who've been on the ground and covered this, and putting all of it together, that particular element of immigration does seem to me that there is a high proportion of economic migrants there. Now, I don't blame these individuals for that. If I was living in some of the countries these guys have come from, I would be trying to make the same journey. So there's no dispute in that respect. But it does seem the minute you raise the idea that people might be economic migrants, straight away, you're written out of the debate as some kind of mad extremist who doesn't like foreigners or dark people.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's funny you mentioned that, because that's something that I'm experiencing at the moment. I mean, I don't know if you know, but I was the first openly gay managing director of a football club. So someone that's promoted...
That's a scandal. You never told us this, David.
Oh, yeah. Someone that's promoted LGBT rights for more than a decade. And I made the point that we need to look at the situation where at present, with the interpretation that we have, essentially effectively any gay person in the majority of the African continent and the Middle East and Muslim countries, technically, if they wanted to, could claim asylum here. That's not sustainable. Of course, we need to protect rights. We need to develop them and remove discrimination and fear on the basis of who you love. Now, because I made that comment, people that haven't read what I've written, I'm getting. I think the word now is cancelled and attacked. It's the same kind of thing. If you say something that is trying to have a grown-up conversation about the issue, which we need to do because it is broken around the world, people immediate knee-jerk reaction, and that's something that I'm now experiencing as well. And so it touches on what you just said. Yeah,
you didn't expect that when you got out of bed the other morning, but that's the way the strange world works. And I think the other point, David, is that, and I don't think this is unreasonable, we live in an era now where it's a very small world. It's never been smaller. Everything is much more tangible. Things are in reach. The idea of travelling to another place is not a controversial or an over-ambitious thing to want to do. People have desires they would never have had 20 years ago. And within that, within the spirit of the current epoch, there are bound to be people who see transition in their lives, moving elsewhere, is something that they can do. A couple of decades back, they might have thought, well, that's impossible. But now it's very probable and possible. And that's the kind of shift as well that doesn't really get factored into this.
Well, absolutely. Like I said earlier, we need to have a global conversation about this. We need to protect those that need protection, and we need to also share the burden of that across the countries. You see the likes of Turkey, who are at the top of the list of the number of refugees they take in. So we need to share the duties, but we also need to protect those that need protecting. And because we haven't had the world a sensible conversation about this, because of things like what we've just mentioned in terms of if you try to do that, you get vilified. But that does need to happen because the situation is getting worse and worse, and it is broken not just in England but around the world. It needs to be fixed.
Indeed. David, always a pleasure. Thank you. Great to have you with us, David Haigh, asylum lawyer, taking that position that you might not imagine asylum lawyers take.